I'm on a strict time limit. I should have written out my remarks because I can get nervous, but I didn't. So we'll see how this goes. I decided to speak to you mostly as an economist to report from the dismal science about what we may have to say about the question of poverty. And the first thing, it has not yet happened today so far, which is good. But when the subject of poverty, especially Pope Francis's remarks about the poverty come up, it ends up being quite polarized. Is he a radical leftist who hates capitalism? Maybe Pope Benedict and especially Pope John Paul II were better on those questions. And in general, there tends to be a lot of polarization about how to think about economics, and especially in relationship to religious teachings on poverty and how we should care for the poor and so on. So the first thing I wanted to do was clear up a misconception about I did leave economics to study theology for a reason, and I will get to that. But to be fair to my former colleagues, the overwhelming majority of economists go into the profession not because they're interested in learning how to pursue more wealth or advocate greed or exploitation or things like that. In point of fact, they're drawn into the profession much the way I was, with an interest in helping poverty and working on unemployment and things like that. There tends to be a mishearing of economists because there's a confusion among non-economists about disputes about the ends we seek and disputes about the means by which we seek to reach those ends. So there's a strong consensus about what the ends should be, and I think that economists are much in line with what any person of goodwill would have, which is we want there to be general prosperity for people so that they can pursue flourishing and meaningful lives. The dispute is typically about the means, and that is economists more than other people think that there's a role for free markets in this pursuit. So I sponsored or was involved in a forum at Notre Dame where I brought an economist together to talk to a theologian, and we had a pre-session to try to get them to have some prayer of conversing, and it was a complete disaster. But our economist was Bill Evans, strong free market economist, and he gave a presentation talking about his work trying to work on poverty in Uganda, and he had slides, and he started crying in the middle of his presentation because he was so moved about the plight of the poor and the desire to help them. So I think it's worth asking when we come to these questions whether our pre-commitment to a given solution, whether it's more market or more state intervention, doesn't start to outweigh our focus on the actual question, which is what should we think about the poor. So in my remaining 7 minutes and 56 seconds, I would like to say 6 things, which is 3 more than I should be wanting to say. I want to ask 3 things about how economics can help us think meaningfully and well about poverty. And then I want to say 3 things about the limitations or drawbacks that the economic approach has. Okay, so how can economics help? Economists understand how much markets can help. And behind that understanding is I think, the fundamental insight that economists prize, and that is understanding that having good intentions does not mean that it's going to lead to good consequences. So there's a tendency on the part of some people to think, if you have a market system that puts a large emphasis on pursuit of self-interest and pursuit of profit and the like, that it must necessarily have bad results for poverty, justice, and those sorts of things, because how could selfish behavior lead to good results? I can dispute the question about what kind of self-interest we're talking about, but in general, the idea that people pursuing their own flourishing will tend to produce economic wealth for others and draw others into prosperity is an insight that goes all the way back to Adam Smith through the invisible hand. And since I've done this work in this zone of economics and theology, I've had the opportunity to hear a lot of speakers, especially from the church, and it's sometimes painful how naive some of the people in the church can be about the value of capitalism. So Pope Francis, and I don't know if this is out of context or not, is quoted as saying capitalism kills. And any economist is going to want to stand up and say, In the last 2 decades, a billion people have been lifted out of poverty, largely through the expansion of markets through the process of globalization. How can you not think that's a good thing? There might well be lots of injustice remaining. There might well be exploitation. There might well be a lot of bad things we can point to. But capitalism is a complex phenomenon, and by and large, it's done a whole lot to lift people out of poverty. And this should be remembered. And by the same token, a lot of well-meaning policies that seem to be directly aimed at trying to help the poor or trying to create justice will have bad consequences because of just the way the world works and the way people are. So for example, I might look at poverty in New York City and think, wow, we need to put on rent control to help the poor people get access to more housing. What, right? That's a good charitable response. But most economists would say if you do a policy like that, because of the way the incentives works, you're going to end up with less housing overall, more poor people out on the streets, and a lot of bad consequences. So economists have a lot to offer by really thinking about how these things work and getting over the naive tendency to think that a good goal means that you've got a good policy, to think more deeply about how the policy works. Now, that said, for a long time, if you wanted to go into development economics and think about trying to do poverty for the global poor, it was a bad move because it was a bad field. It was not developing very well. Development economics for a long time had these big micro models that said, if you have X amount of capital and X amount of labor and it mixes around this way, you'll get this result. And so for 50 years, we were working on trying to help the developing world develop, and economists did not, in fact, have much to offer. But in the last 10 years or so, your clock went out, so I don't know where I am. So I will talk faster. In the last 10 or 20 years, the economists have gotten more micro-scale. They've gotten more eclectic in their ways of approaching the question of poverty. My former colleague at Harvard, Abhijit Banerjee, and his partner Esther Duflo have a great book called Poor Economics that I would recommend to everybody that says, let's get away from this question about whether we should have big state programs or big market programs, and instead let's go in on a village-by-village basis and just do a lot of experiments and see what might work. Does an immunization program help or hurt here? Do these kinds of programs help or hurt there? They get an eclectic mix of results. But notice it's more micro, it's more focused on the particular, away from these big abstract general models. So that's a very hopeful sign from economics. The other move in economics that I find very hopeful is they're getting a little bit less insular and starting to think about economic issues in the context of political issues, and thinking about the nexus between politics and economics, which is good because the root of the discipline was political economics, and they're going back to that. And so it's giving them a greater vocabulary for thinking about when do markets work and when do they fail in relationship to complex political, cultural structures. There's a book called Why Nations Fail by Asamoah and Robinson that brings this out very well. Okay, so I think economics has always had value to these questions and is moving in directions to have even more value. So what are the limitations or the dangers of listening only to economics on the question of poverty? First and foremost, and this has already been discussed, so I'm preaching to the choir, evidently, but we have a strong tendency when we talk about poverty, then we immediately think, well, economists should talk about poverty, and that means we're thinking about poverty in monetary or material terms as being the thing that matters. And if you listen to Pope Francis in his exhortation, yeah, he's talking about poverty, but he's talking about exclusion and marginalization. We've already hit this quite a bit. But by having economics seem to be the science of wealth, and presumably therefore the science that you'd want to go to cure the problem of poverty, I think we start to think about it in monetary, material, physical terms. And in point of fact, the poverty that matters is entirely one of relationship and what does it mean to be without power or with power. And the varieties of poverty are enormous. I think it's a very different thing to be poor in Appalachia than it is to be poor in South Central LA. There are different phenomena and so on. And I think we need to keep our eye on that subject. The second distraction that economics can bring to this is they're part of a culture-wide tendency to think that science is the way that we know things, and especially numerical, quantifiable knowledge is what counts as real knowledge, and they have their big statistical studies. And so there tends to be a tendency to aggregate all the data and try to find general tendencies about how things work. And I think that, again, takes our eye off the human dimension. By collapsing everything into something that can be measured, we miss out on the human things that are going on. And again, that variety, the fact that I don't think poverty is at all the same phenomenon from one place to another. And our tendency to want to aggregate into statistical data can make it harder for us to find that. And the last, and this really warmed my heart this morning, because you already know this, so I thought I was going to tell you something new. But with economics and its focus on policies and institutions that we should set up to try to help with the problem of poverty, there's a real tendency to think about the poor as objects for whom something should be done, or that we can design things to manipulate so good things will happen in their lives. And it minimizes our sense that they're actors, and it takes away from our idea that maybe one way to learn about poverty would be to work with the poor and to talk with the poor, and above all, to build relationship with them. And the way I put it is, it's a difference between feeding the hungry and inviting them to dinner. And I think the economic mindset can lead us a little bit astray that way. So those are my comments.